voices through the silence. If outrage can be manufactured for profit, how many lives have already paid the cost? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber had never been this charged. Beneath the gold eagle crest of the U.S. Capitol, the special congressional hearing on disinformation in the post-truth era was called to order. There were no pleasantries, no applause, just a thick, electric silence, like the calm before a political execution. Seated in the center of the grand hearing room, Candace Owens, media firebrand and cultural agitator, was poised at the witness table, her expression steeled with defiance. She had been invited not as a criminal, but as a distinguished influencer in media to speak on behalf of freedom of expression. But everyone in the room knew this was no tribute. It was a trap being set with precision. Across from her, seated high behind the oak dais, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, now chairing the committee with unshakable poise. Her gavel rested untouched. Her files were already open. Her posture was calm, but her eyes were loaded with intent. She wasn't here to play politics. She was here to interrogate power. Crockett was flanked by aides, legal advisors, and two massive LED panels already synced to incoming data. Her voice hadn't spoken a word yet, but the tension she carried was louder than thunder. Owens sat back in her seat, legs crossed, defiant smile drawn tight across her face like armor. But even she couldn't ignore the quiet shifting of the atmosphere. Something in the room had changed. This wasn't the soft platform she was used to. This was Capitol Hill under full exposure. No scripts, no cuts, no edits. And across from her sat the one woman she couldn't out-talk, out-shout, or outsmart. No one in the room could have predicted what was about to unfold, but in less than an hour, an empire built on outrage would start to crack, and Candace Owens wouldn't see it coming. But just as the air thickened with anticipation, it wasn't the committee that struck first. It was Candace Owens, who leaned into the microphone not to defend herself, but to ignite a firestorm before a single question could be asked. Her voice didn't tremble. It surged, calculated, cold and laced with fury masked as righteousness. "What's happening here today isn't justice," she declared, her eyes sweeping the room like a predator stalking familiar territory. "It's punishment." She didn't wait for a prompt. She didn't acknowledge the chair. She launched forward with a clarity honed over years of talk shows, online tirades, and headlines engineered to provoke. The truth is simple. The United States government, the mainstream media, and the tech empires that control your news feeds, they don't want people like me speaking freely, not because I lie, not because I manipulate, but because I refuse to submit. She let the silence hang before detonating the next line like a grenade. "I am a black woman who dares to think differently, and for that, they'd rather burn me at the stake than let me speak at the table." She said it not with fear, but with practiced venom, an indictment aimed at everyone in the room and everyone watching across the country. She turned her body toward the cameras now, abandoning the committee altogether. "I ask questions. Dangerous ones? Yes, but only dangerous to the people who benefit from silence." Her words oozed with moral superiority, each syllable delivered with the cadence of a viral clip waiting to explode across social media. "They hate that I shine a light where they prefer shadows. They hate that I'm not on their leash. And most of all, they hate that I do it while black." She leaned back slowly in her chair, arms folded, gaze unblinking. "So don't confuse this hearing for accountability. This is retaliation. This is what it looks like when the establishment realizes it can't control the narrative anymore." For a moment, the room was paralyzed. The audience, a sea of political aides, press corps, and victims of misinformation, absorbed the speech like a slap. And yet, in the middle of the chaos she was trying to conjure, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't even blink. Instead, she calmly slid her pen across a notepad with surgeon-like precision, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. She made a single check mark beside a bullet point on the page, then gently nodded, as if confirming something she already knew would happen. No rebuttal, no confrontation, just a nod. And in that moment, her silence pierced louder than Owens's entire monologue. The audience felt it, tensely, viscerally. that Jasmine wasn't threatened, that she wasn't rattled, that this entire outburst had been anticipated. Owens had come into the hearing chamber believing she could twist the narrative in her favor with sound bites and firebrand theatrics. But Crockett had brought something else entirely, an arsenal of restraint, timing, and facts still hidden beneath sealed folders and flickering screens. The silence that followed Owens's rant wasn't weakness. It was the sound of a blade being drawn in the shadows, calm, quiet, and mercilessly deliberate. And though Candace Owens had the floor, what she didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett had already taken the room. She had claimed to be the victim of censorship, the rebel with no backers, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't chasing feelings. She was chasing funding, and now the numbers were ready to speak. Jasmine Crockett moved with a stillness that made the room lean in, not out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply reached for the small black remote resting beside her binder, clicked once, and turned toward the screen behind her with surgical timing. The lights dimmed by a fraction, just enough for the white text on the digital display to sear into the eyes of everyone watching. At the top of the slide, the words, Candace Owens, Undisclosed Income, 2022 to 2024. And beneath it, a single, unignorable figure, $10,271,893. Jasmine let the silence do the heavy lifting for a beat before speaking. That, she began with calm precision, is how much Ms. Owens has received from untraceable entities, many of which have no visible board, no stated mission, and no tax records. She let her eyes sweep the room slowly. Meanwhile, her media output during that same period spiked by 146%. Coincidentally, right as disinformation about public health, election integrity, and civil rights reached critical mass in this country. The room shifted, stiffened. Journalists scribbled faster. Committee members exchanged glances. But Owens didn't look shaken. Not yet. She leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other with casual defiance and raised her eyebrows. "So what?" she said, chuckling under her breath. "I earned that. I'm not some puppet. People pay because they believe in what I say. I've got reach. I've got followers. That's what value looks like in the free market." Her voice curled like smoke, aimed not at the committee, but at the camera. Always the camera. She didn't flinch. She thrived in controversy. She assumed this would pass, like every headline before. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She simply raised one hand. No words, just a crisp, deliberate snap of her fingers. The screen behind her burst to life again, and this time, it didn't show numbers. It showed names, dozens of them. BioTruth Collective, Eagle Justice Network, Liberty Path Fund, Free Nation PAC. Each name was flanked by damning footnotes, redacted security briefings, leaked memos, foreign financial ties, propaganda markers. Then came the arrows, red crisscrossing lines connecting each group to incendiary campaigns Owens had fronted. The vaccine lie, the BLM scam, Patriot Uprising, the truth about John 6. The screen pulsed like a map of a war zone, because that's what it was. The oxygen left the room. Crockett's voice didn't rise, but it cut cleaner than ever. "These aren't fan clubs," she said evenly. "They're information laundering machines. Many of them operate out of think tanks with shell fronts, untraceable donors, and back-end links to offshore interests flagged by cybersecurity analysts and DHS task forces. They don't pay you because they believe you, Ms. Owens. They pay you because you're useful." Then she turned to Candace, fully for the first time. "You're not an independent voice. You're an asset, deniable, disposable, but highly effective, until now." Owens's smirk faltered. Barely, but it was enough. Her lawyer shifted in his seat. Aides scribbled something urgent on paper. Across the country, in airports and bars and break rooms, Americans watching paused mid-sip. It was no longer a debate about opinion. It was a deconstruction of a machine, and the woman who stood at its center, cloaked in martyrdom but funded by shadows. And Jasmine Crockett had just pulled the first thread loose. The money trail was damning, but Jasmine Crockett knew it wasn't enough to just expose how the machine was built. She had to show where it bled. A sharp tap echoed as Crockett pressed a button embedded in the panel before her. The lights dimmed again, not theatrically, but surgically, like an operating room preparing for incision. The screen behind her reanimated, this time pulsing with a map of the United States bathed in heat signatures, shifting from pale yellow to deep crimson. Across the digital landscape, glowing clusters throbbed in cities, counties, and rural outposts alike, each one representing a concentration of viewer engagement with Candace Owens's most inflammatory content. At first, it looked like a simple analytics presentation, but as Crockett walked down from her chair and stepped to the floor, laser pointer in hand, the second layer slid into place, a transparent overlay of FBI-verified hate crime surges pinned to the same regions. The audience inhaled collectively. Cities like Tulsa, Orlando, Kenosha, and Mobile burned redder than the rest, not with heat, but with anger, fear, and real-world violence. Crockett stood centered in front of the map, the glow of data flickering across her face like a battlefield hologram. Her voice was low, measured, not theatrical, but lethal in its clarity. "What you're seeing," she began, "is not coincidence. It's correlation. This is the digital residue of weaponized speech." She tapped the pointer once, zooming into Arkansas. "On April 12th, your video titled 'The Race Card is Dead' surged to 2.3 million views in 48 hours. Another tap. On April 15, a Black-owned bookstore in Little Rock was defaced with racial slurs and its windows smashed in. The screen split. Owens's video thumbnail on the left, news footage of the vandalism on the right. The timestamp alignment was surgical. "You didn't throw that brick," Crockett said, turning slowly to face Owens, "but you handed someone the weight and told them where to aim." She didn't need to yell. She didn't need theatrics. The data was a scalpel, not a hammer. "Ms. Owens," she continued, gesturing toward the growing timeline unfolding across the screen, "these aren't fringe events. These are repeated spikes in violence, always within 72 hours of your content going viral in specific counties." Now a third layer slid into view, geo-targeted social media trend lines, showing the echo chambers where Owens's language morphed into rage-fueled calls to action. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was causality, visible, traceable, bleeding from screen to street. Crockett returned to her seat slowly, letting the silence harden like concrete. Then she looked up, voice cool as glass. "You don't just speak to millions. You saturate them with fear, with suspicion, with license to act." The final image froze on screen, a side-by-side of Owens's YouTube dashboard, glowing green with monetized views, and a police body cam still of a young Latino boy, bloodied after being attacked by men screaming slogans pulled word for word from one of her live streams. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't need to. The room didn't breathe. Because for the first time, they weren't looking at influence. They were staring directly at impact. The chamber sat suspended in silence, the screen still burning with data and faces that couldn't be erased. And for the first time since the hearing began, the woman at the center of it all began to crack. Candace Owens shifted in her seat, but this time it wasn't performative. It was nervous. Her fingers tapped the side of her chair in a staccato rhythm, betraying the crackling current under her skin. The smirk that had carried her through countless interviews, debates, and viral standoffs had vanished, replaced by something harder to name. Anger, yes, but laced with uncertainty. "That's anecdotal," she snapped, her voice louder than necessary, too sharp, too fast. "That's not how algorithms work. You can't connect hate crimes to engagement spikes. That's not science." She looked around, eyes darting, not toward Crockett, but toward the press gallery, the cameras, the shadowed faces in the observation rows. "I don't control who watches my content. No one does. It's random. It's chaos. It's math." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough to make everyone in the room feel the tremor. Crockett didn't respond. She didn't need to. The data was still glowing on the screen behind her, cold and merciless. View counts layered over emergency room admissions. Comments like, "We're taking the country back," aligned to timestamps of racial assaults. Owens's outburst was a wall thrown up too late, and everyone watching knew it. Her tone was no longer that of the fearless provocateur. It was the voice of someone cornered by receipts, of someone who thought they were playing a game of narratives, but had wandered into a battlefield of numbers and consequences. And for the first time, the empire of certainty she'd wrapped around herself began to tremble. The data had cornered her, the maps had shaken her, but it was the voice from behind her own walls that would deal the deepest cut. And Crockett, calm as ever, had been saving him like a loaded chamber. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't announce anything with drama or flair. Instead, she looked down briefly at a single line in her notes, then lifted her eyes and said with quiet finality, "Madam Chair calls Mr. Aidan Keller to testify." The name meant nothing to most in the room, until the side door creaked open and a slender man stepped in, shoulders tight, jaw locked, and eyes blinking against the flood of flashbulbs and whispers that erupted like gas through dry air. He moved toward the witness chair with the careful steps of someone walking back into a fire they once escaped. But Jasmine's tone was unshaken, mercilessly precise. Former lead video editor for Owens Media Group, employed from 2019 to 2024, under direct contract. The color drained from Candace Owens's face. She didn't blink, but her lips parted ever so slightly as if she had just tasted poison. Keller adjusted the microphone, his hand trembling once, then still. "I came here because I couldn't keep pretending," he said, his voice low but unmistakably clear. "We weren't telling stories. We were building emotional weapons." Gas rippled again, but he continued without hesitation. Every video was tailored to ignite something specific: fear, rage, tribalism. We were told to find the quote that would divide, trim away any context that humanized the subject, and amplify only the tension. The truth wasn't the goal. Engagement was. He paused, locking eyes with no one in particular. And yes, that came from the top. The room froze. Journalists stopped typing. Staffers stopped whispering. For the first time, Candace Owens didn't just look challenged, she looked cornered. Behind Jasmine Crockett, the screens roared back to life, not with bullet points, but with damning proof. Internal Owens Media emails marked for final cut, filled with phrases like boost outrage cadence, cut for emotion over logic, delay fact-check overlay until after viral window. They weren't editing for clarity. They were editing for combustion. Jasmine said nothing. She simply folded her hands and waited. The silence was more ruthless than 1,000 accusations. Finally, Owens turned her head slightly, not to defend, not to rebut, but to glare sideways at the man she had once paid to sharpen her voice. Her lips barely moved, but those closest could hear the venom slip through clenched teeth. "You coward!" It wasn't the shout of someone defiant, it was the whisper of someone betrayed, exposed, and slowly drowning in her own reflection. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They just watched, as if witnessing a dam crack from the inside. The first fracture audible before the whole thing collapses. Candace Owens had entered the hearing cloaked in armor, but now it was clear. The breach wasn't from her enemies. It had come from within. The testimony had punctured her defenses, but what came next didn't come from a witness or a document. It came from her own mouth, captured in a moment she never expected to face in a courtroom built for truth. Without a word, Jasmine Crockett tapped twice on her tablet. The lights dimmed slightly, not for effect but for control, as the central screen shifted to a black box with a single white title: Internal Staff Briefing, Owens Media Group, Confidential. Then audio. Raw. Undeniable. Candace's voice crackled into the chamber, off mic but crystal clear, the kind of audio that couldn't be denied because it carried not just her sound, but her intent. "Let's stop pretending people care about the facts," her voice said, casual and confident. "They just want someone to yell what they're thinking. They want someone to punch for them, verbally. So we give them that." Laughter followed from somewhere off screen. Staffers, likely. Then Owens's voice again, firmer now. "Truth doesn't go viral. Anger does. Doubt does. Rage does. People want to feel something, not think. They want someone to shout their fears back to them, like gospel." She laughed again, low and cold. "Truth is boring, but rage Rage pays. The silence that followed was brutal. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of confirmation. That sickening pause when suspicion curdles into proof. Dozens of heads turned to Owens. She didn't move, not even an inch. Her shoulders were locked, eyes fixed forward, jaw visibly clenched. It was no longer a hearing, it was a mirror, and she was being forced to watch herself speak without filter, without script, without the armor of post-production spin. What she'd built her empire on, righteous defiance, was now echoing back at her as pure manipulation. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, deliberately, letting the tension stew until it saturated the air. She didn't speak right away. She let the final words of the recording float, "Rage pays," until they burned into the marble. Then, with a tone that sliced through the silence, she locked eyes with Owens and said, "You weren't delivering truth. You were engineering outrage." She stepped closer to the center of the floor, her voice never rising, but growing heavier with each word. "You didn't offer facts. You offered adrenaline. You weren't broadcasting insight. You were trafficking in chaos." She turned slightly, addressing the room now, not just the witness. This wasn't commentary. It was emotional exploitation dressed in commentary skin. And the public? They weren't just your audience. They were your product. No one spoke. No one moved. The image of Candace Owens's face, frozen in the grainy footage, still hovered behind Crockett, smiling in a moment of unguarded honesty, now turned to national evidence. And in that moment, even Candace seemed to realize the war wasn't just over narrative anymore. It was over ownership of consequence. Crockett had exposed the lies, the money, the manipulation, but now she stepped into the one place Owens couldn't spin or deflect, the human aftermath. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice or slam a gavel. She simply stood, walked to the edge of the platform, and looked straight into the heart of the hearing room. Her voice, when it came, was low and unwavering. "We've heard the numbers. We've seen the strategy. Now let's meet someone who lived the consequences." A quiet gasp fluttered through the gallery as the doors opened, and a woman stepped forward, mid-30s in worn navy blue scrubs, her hospital badge clipped to the collar like armor. Her name, Raina Timmons, an ICU nurse from Birmingham, Alabama. Her gait was careful, restrained, like someone who had learned to brace for impact even when entering silence. She took her seat beside the microphone, adjusted it with slow hands, and looked up, not at Crockett, not at Owens, but at the empty air in front of her, as if the moment she was about to relive still hung there. "My name is Raina Timmons," she began, her voice delicate but sharp, each syllable clipped by memory. "I've been a nurse for 11 years. I've held dying hands. I've comforted families through glass." She paused, swallowing. "But I've never been spat on. Not until last fall." Her hands clenched the sides of her chair as she continued, her breath shallow. "A man came into our hospital. COVID positive, unvaccinated, aggressive. I tried to help. I approached with kindness. He looked me in the eye and said, 'You're one of them. You're lying. Candace said so.' The air in the room turned heavy, pressing against every chest. I told him I was there to save him. He spit in my face," she whispered. "He said, 'You're the problem. You're what's killing us.' And as security dragged him out, he shouted, 'Candace Owens warned us about people like you.'" The silence that followed was suffocating. Crockett stood frozen, jaw set, while cameras captured every flicker of emotion washing over the room. The nurse turned toward Owens, not with anger, but with something worse, betrayal. "You didn't hurt me with your hands," Raina said. "You did it with your voice. You gave people permission to see me as an enemy. And I still go to work. I still treat them. But I carry that moment like a stain I can't wash off." She turned back to the mic, her voice now barely a whisper. "What did I do to deserve that, Miss Owens? Was it because I believed in medicine? Or was it because I was a black woman in a hospital coat?" Candace Owens didn't answer. She couldn't. Her face, once carved in confident defiance, had gone motionless. Only her hands moved, gripping the chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She stared down at the floor, eyes unblinking, her lips drawn into a thin line as if the room had started to close in around her. There was no comeback, no viral retort, no lighting to fix this in post. Just the echo of one woman's story, undeniable, unspinnable, and the silence of a nation beginning to understand that the real cost of disinformation isn't lost arguments. It's people like Raina Timmons. The testimony had drawn blood, and the human cost had shaken the room. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to stir sympathy. She was here to follow the money, and now the receipts were radioactive. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With a quiet flick of her finger across the tablet before her, she summoned a new screen that eclipsed every chart before it. The display filled with a high-resolution financial matrix, rows upon rows of international wire transfers, color-coded to indicate origin, volume, and recipient. "Let's pivot to funding," she said evenly, but her words cut with the finality of a verdict. She stood, pointing with the stylus in her right hand. Between March 11th and August 4th of last year, Owens Media Group received a series of high-value deposits totaling $3.4 million. Her voice sharpened. What's particularly fascinating is where these payments came from. Two so-called think tanks, one based in Moscow, the other in Budapest, both routed through anonymous shell corporations with no digital footprint beyond encrypted landing pages and post office boxes. A collective tightening rippled through the chamber. Every set of eyes, from press to panelists to public attendees, snapped to the screen as Jasmine zoomed into two flagged transactions, each tied to institutions previously cited in European Union reports for propaganda dissemination and digital destabilization campaigns. "Now," Crockett continued, walking slowly across the floor, "these transactions occurred precisely 72 hours before Ms. Owens released a series of monetized videos titled The Ukraine Deception, NATO's Hidden Agenda, and the Great Lie of Eastern Sympathy." She turned back toward Owens. "So I'll ask plainly, why were you receiving untraceable funds from foreign entities that specialize in information warfare, just before you publicly parroted their geopolitical narratives on American soil?" Candace Owens froze. Not entirely, but enough for the room to feel it. The breath she took was shallow. Her tongue clicked softly as she formed the words, but the timing betrayed her. "Those were donations," she said at last, her tone strained, far from her earlier swagger. "Independent contributions. My platform is global. People send money all the time. I don't check every single source." Her voice cracked slightly. "It's free speech. They support what I say. That doesn't mean I'm working for them." Crockett arched a single brow. "No one said you were working for them. I said they're paying you." She clicked once more, and the screen split, one side showing a wire transfer time-stamped at 11:17 a.m. March 13th, the other playing Owens's video uploaded at 3:41 p.m. the same day, where she called Ukraine a deep state distraction designed to funnel U.S. taxpayer dollars into corrupt foreign hands. The room exhaled sharply, the collective tension breaking not in relief, but recognition. There was no theory left, just timestamps, just numbers, just choices made, money received, messages delivered. Candace's lips parted as if to reply, but nothing came. Her hand, once clenched around the chair arm, released slightly, fingers twitching. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was incriminating, and it stretched like a shadow over the hearing, long and cold. Jasmine Crockett didn't press. She didn't need to. She had done what no viral clip, no fact check, no opposition takedown could ever do. She had tethered words to motive, and motive to money. With her narrative unraveling and her composure cracking, Candace Owens stayed silent. But the man paid to speak for her tried one final maneuver, reaching not for truth, but for technicality. The lawyer rose stiffly, clearing his throat like someone buying time with air. His suit was impeccable, his expression strained, and his words landed not with conviction, but with the nervous polish of a man trying to shield his client from a tide already breaching the walls. "Madam Chair," he began, holding a thin folder like a talisman, "we object to the direction of this proceeding. Much of the evidence introduced today, including financial disclosures and third-party testimony, was not submitted in accordance with the expected pre-hearing disclosure requirements. He paused, scanning for sympathy that didn't exist. Given these procedural concerns, we request a temporary recess for review and consultation. This hearing is no longer fact-finding, it's a hostile ambush. The chamber didn't gasp, didn't move, but something in the air changed. Less tension, more resignation. Even those who had once believed in Owens's media poise could now see the edges folding inward. Jasmine Crockett didn't respond right away. She took a breath, closed the binder in front of her with calm finality, and slowly stood. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, measured, surgical. She looked at the attorney not with scorn, but with the disinterest of someone who had already anticipated every defense before it left the mouth. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," she said, her voice low but unshakably firm. "You don't need a calendar invite to recognize the truth." She took a step closer to the dais, not looming, not towering, just present, in a way that couldn't be denied. This hearing is not theater. It's not a curated broadcast. It's not a safe space for scripted rebuttals and PR framing. Then, without a pause, she turned her full body toward the camera embedded above the chamber clock, a direct stare into the living rooms, phone screens, and office monitors of a nation watching. Her voice didn't rise, but its weight grew heavy. This is Congress, not a talk show, and not a sanctuary for spin. Her words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The stillness that followed was sharper than applause. Owens's lawyer sank slowly back into his seat, and Owens herself, eyes still locked on the desk, didn't lift her head, because there was no break coming, no intermission. The lights were on, the cameras were live, and the script was no longer hers to control. The defense had collapsed, the courtroom was breathless, and Candace Owens, once untouchable behind a wall of microphones, was now caught between her own contradictions. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply let the truth speak in Owens's own voice. The room darkened just slightly. The overhead lights dimmed enough to let the monitors glow like the surface of a scalpel. On Crockett's signal, the screen behind her came to life, not with charts or accusations, but with something far more damning. "Owens!" Speaking Owens into submission, the image crackled into place. Candace Owens on a stage in Georgia, March 2021, flanked by American flags and a roaring crowd. Her voice rang out across the hearing chamber in a tone sharpened by certainty. "The COVID vaccine is a government-engineered bioweapon. You are not protecting yourself, you're submitting to control. They want your DNA, your compliance, your children." Before anyone could react, the image jumped. Same face, different set, months later. Owens now seated in a sleek podcast studio, calm, polished, sipping from a branded mug. "Of course I got the vaccine," she says with a laugh. "I'm not anti-science. I fly internationally twice a month. What, do you think I'm reckless?" A ripple of unease tore through the gallery. Crockett stood still, her arms at her sides, watching the screen with the patience of someone who had played this sequence in her mind 100 times. The screen split now. On one side, Owens railing against state-sponsored chemical warfare. On the other, the same voice citing a belief in modern medicine. There was no editorializing, no dramatic music, just her words. Two versions of the same woman, each making the other impossible to believe. Then came the second montage. The screen cut to black before fading into a sunlit park. Candace at the height of her influence during the 2020 unrest, holding a megaphone. Her face was thunderous, her tone explosive. "Black Lives Matter is a fraud. They exploit tragedy to build power. It's a mafia cloaked in morality. And if you're defending them, you're part of the con." The audience in the hearing chamber stirred, some visibly bristling, but Crockett said nothing. She only gestured, and the next clip rolled. This time it was 2021. A sit-down interview with a right-leaning outlet. Owens was more reflective, her voice softer. "I marched for BLM in 2014. I believed. I chanted their slogans. I cried for Michael Brown. I wanted change." She paused on screen, her hands folded gently in her lap. "But I got older. I saw things differently. That's what growth is." Back in the hearing chamber, there was no applause. No outburst, only discomfort. Crockett could feel it. She let it settle. Every person watching, here or on live stream, was being made to confront the simple truth. Owens wasn't just inconsistent, she was transactional. Her opinions weren't beliefs, they were leverage points, shaped to the moment, contorted to fit the market. The final clip faded and the screen returned to black. Jasmine stepped forward into the center of the floor, her heels clicking with slow, deliberate gravity. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence tighten, a noose made of exposure. Then she turned, not to Owens but to the American people watching through the lens of every camera pointed at the room. Free speech, she began, her voice unwavering, is not a weapon to be used against truth. It is not a hall pass for hypocrisy. It is not the right to deceive and walk away clean. She pivoted now, facing Owens directly for the first time in several minutes. When you say one thing in March and the opposite in July, that's not evolution, that's convenience. Her tone sharpened like flint against steel. When you call BLM a mafia on stage, but claim to have once marched for them on camera, you are not demonstrating depth. You are demonstrating contradiction, strategic contradiction. She stepped closer, now just feet from the witness table where Owens sat visibly rigid. People evolve, opinions shift, but what we've just witnessed is not change. It's marketing. It's pivot for profit. It's message trafficking based not on principle, but on audience metrics. Her voice dropped slightly, more intimate, more cutting. You didn't tell the truth. You sold what your viewers wanted to hear until it stopped being profitable. The weight of it settled like smoke. Owens didn't move. Her fingers trembled slightly against the rim of her water glass, still untouched since the montage began. Her jaw clenched, but no words came. What could she say? That both versions of her were valid? That contradiction was authenticity? Crockett had already closed that door and locked it. Then came the final line. Crockett stepped back, lifted her eyes once more to the gallery, then to the nation through the lens, and delivered it with the calm of a woman who had done the work. Free speech is not the right to lie and walk away. The words dropped like a final gavel, not shouted, not dramatized, but etched into the floor, the air, and the country's collective consciousness. For years, Candace Owens had played the system like a stage, but here, in this chamber, with the lights unfiltered and the footage uncut, the script had turned against her, and no clever edit could rewrite what had just been exposed. She had just been dismantled by her own contradictions, her words turned into weapons against her. But Jasmine Crockett had one final payload, and it wasn't on camera or in public record. It was private, and it was devastating. The screen flickered once more, the room dimming as if instinctively bracing for impact. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "The committee has received a series of encrypted internal messages extracted from a whistleblower within Owens Media Group, verified through third-party forensic analysts." She walked slowly toward the witness table, a single sheet of paper in hand, but it wasn't paper that mattered. It was what was printed on it. Behind her, the screen lit up again, now displaying a digital message log. The sender, c.owens@omg.tv. The recipient, a redacted internal contact. Timestamp, November 2nd, 2023. Subject, narrative strategy. And then the quote, "It didn't scream, it didn't need to. I can make people doubt anything. What they choose to do with that doubt afterward, that's not my responsibility." No emoji, no caveat, just calculated casual detachment. There was a moment, so brief it could have been missed, where the entire room stopped breathing. No one stirred. No one whispered. Even the cameramen froze behind their viewfinders, as if the silence itself was sacred. Because it wasn't just a quote, it was a confession, a blueprint, the architecture of her brand laid bare in black and white. Owens had always danced on the edge of plausible deniability, but here it was, the admission that doubt wasn't a byproduct. It was the product. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the paper like it had weight. Then she looked up, directly at Owens, and read the line aloud again, slowly, measured, final. "I can make people doubt anything. What they choose to do with that doubt afterward, that's not my responsibility. She didn't editorialize. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let the words hang like a guillotine suspended mid-drop. Candace Owens' face changed, not crumbling, but contracting. Her eyes blinked rapidly, her shoulders tensed, her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Color rose to her cheeks in a slow, irreversible flood, and her right hand gripped the table's edge as if she could will her body to remain still, to stop from trembling beneath the weight of her own arrogance finally unmasked. Crockett took a single step forward. "Not your responsibility," she repeated, almost a whisper. "Not when they storm a hospital. Not when they spit in the face of a nurse. Not when they torch a mural. Not when they point a gun and say, 'She warned me.'" The air thickened with every syllable. "You fed them suspicion like oxygen, and now you want to claim you're not responsible for the fire?" Crockett's voice didn't tremble. It was low, controlled, devastating. And then came the rupture. Someone in the gallery let out an audible, "Oh my God." Another stood, snapping a photo of the screen. Then it began. The building hum of chaos, the sudden shift from stunned silence to full-on eruption. Gasps, murmurs, shouts. Phones lit up, cameras zoomed, reporters ran from the back rows to secure satellite feeds. One journalist from the BBC shouted into her mic in real time, "We are witnessing an extraordinary moment here in Washington." A producer from France 24 waved frantically at her cameraman to adjust the angle. Live feeds switched from the White House to the hearing room in under 15 seconds. Social media boiled over. Hashtags ignited. "Not my responsibility" began trending globally before Crockett even returned to her seat. Amid the commotion, Owens didn't move. Her gaze dropped from the screen to her lap, her chin quivering just once, imperceptibly to most, but not to Crockett. She saw it. She sensed it. That moment when bravado finally surrendered to gravity. Owens had survived 1,000 debates, 1,000,000 tweets, a dozen firestorms of her own making. But now, she was wordless. And the silence wasn't strength. It was surrender. Crockett, ever precise, waited for the noise to plateau before delivering her final blow in this segment. She stepped behind her desk, adjusted the mic with steady fingers, and looked once more. Not at Owens, but at the people behind her, at the cameras, at the world. "We are not here to police speech," she said. "We are here to protect the consequences of speech from being sold as entertainment." She let that sink in. Doubt is not neutral when it is weaponized. Misinformation is not harmless when monetized. And power, her voice dropped to a near whisper, is not innocent when it profits from chaos. She sat down. No mic drop, no posturing, just silence, the most honest sound left in the room. And as the feed was broadcast live on 5 continents, there was no longer any question of what Candace Owens had built. It wasn't a movement. It was a machine of doubt. And now it was coming apart piece by bloody piece, under the merciless light of congressional record. The eruption had passed, the screens faded to black, and all that remained was the quiet, the kind that presses against your ribs and doesn't let go. Now came the question that had waited beneath every receipt, every contradiction, every bruise. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat once more, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the solemnity of someone about to close a chapter that had taken years to write. Her heels made no sound now as she approached the witness table. Only the weight of her presence moved the air. In her hand, she held no folder, no evidence, no printed statement. She needed none. Everything had already been shown, heard, felt. She stopped exactly 1 pace from the table, her eyes fixed on Candace Owens. Eyes not full of rage, but of relentless clarity. Her voice, when it came, was steady, even gentle. But beneath that calm was a blade honed for the final cut. "I'm going to ask this only once more, Miss Owens," she said, letting the words breathe. "Do you take responsibility for what you've said, for what it caused, for the people who listened, who acted, who bled?" She didn't blink. She didn't move. The question hung in the air like a live wire, crackling in the silence. The room had no ceiling, no walls, no floor, just stillness. Every eye in the chamber turned to Owens, and for the first time, There was no camera she could turn to, no narrative she could hijack. It was just her and the reckoning she'd spent years outrunning. Her hands remained folded in her lap, knuckles white with pressure. She inhaled slowly, as if preparing to speak. But then, nothing, not a word. Her eyes locked on the edge of the table, unfocused. Her lips pressed together. A single muscle beneath her right eye twitched. But still, nothing. The silence grew. 10 seconds, then 20. A murmur started at the edges of the gallery, the kind born not from disrespect, but from the unbearable pressure of anticipation. Crockett didn't flinch. She stood like a monument, her presence the only sound in the room. At 30 seconds, a cameraman in the far aisle adjusted his lens and stepped back, as if to widen the shot for what everyone now realized was a moment history would record. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. 40 seconds. Owens blinked once. A shallow breath. Her jaw tensed and relaxed again. But still, no answer. At the 50-second mark, a rustle passed through the committee dais. Aides leaned forward. Microphones flickered to life. Chairwoman Ellis, seated 2 places down from Crockett, exchanged a glance with the Parliamentary Council. No one needed to confer. No one needed a vote tally. The room had already spoken. At exactly 1 minute and 4 seconds into the silence, Chairwoman Ellis leaned forward and tapped her gavel lightly. Just once. "Let the record reflect," she said, her voice flat and final, "that the witness has declined to respond." The words landed like a lid being sealed on a coffin. Jasmine Crockett turned slowly, returning to her desk without drama, without flourish. She sat, opened her binder once more, and spoke not to the witness, but to the nation. "Let the record also reflect that silence in the face of consequence is not exoneration. It is acknowledgement." Behind her, the monitors lit up, not with footage this time, but with a simple white slide bearing the crest of the Oversight Committee. Below it, in block type, Resolution number 48-17B, Authorization for Expansion of Inquiry into Foreign Influence, Platform Monetization, and Public Harm. The room stirred again, this time with purpose. Phones buzzed, typing resumed. Cameramen adjusted lenses for exit shots. But no one looked at Owens. Not anymore. Because the story had shifted. The power had moved. And the silence she had once weaponized now sat around her shoulders like a closing fist. She sat alone, eyes fixed forward, hands motionless. The table before her was clean. The screen behind her was bare. But everything she had built, every fragment of certainty, every word sharpened into ideology, every fire she'd lit and walked away from, was now under oath, under scrutiny, under investigation. And no microphone in the world could speak on her behalf now. That minute of silence would live longer than any soundbite she'd ever shouted. The silence had spoken louder than any defense ever could. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to end this hearing with noise. She would end it with a line that would echo longer than a shout, and she knew exactly what it would be. She stood slowly, her posture unshaken, not a single page in her binder out of place. The screen behind her remained blank, the lights overhead warming back to their full brightness. But the atmosphere in the room stayed heavy, charged with something irreversible. Her eyes, calm but lit with conviction, scanned the room one last time. Not as a victor surveying the aftermath of a battle, but as a truth-teller who had delivered the final word with restraint, not rage. Then, without fanfare, Jasmine Crockett spoke her closing line, the kind carved not from rhetoric, but from reality. "Truth does not need to shout," she said. Her voice was soft, but every syllable was crystalline. "It only needs to stand still and let the light find it." The room froze, not with tension, but with stillness. A reverent pause. No applause followed, nor should it. This wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. And in that moment, the line didn't just settle in the air. It took root. It wasn't spoken for Owens. It was spoken for the people beyond the hearing room, for the nurse still haunted by a patient's hate, for the viewers duped into paranoia, for the truth buried beneath noise. Then came the shift. Candace Owens slowly stood, her chair legs scraping against the hardwood like a warning bell. She didn't look back at the committee. She didn't glance at Crockett. Her face was stony, her expression locked somewhere between indignation and exhaustion. But her silence screamed the loudest. She gathered nothing. No notes, no folders, no defense. Everything she had walked in with had been reduced to footage, contradictions, and unanswered questions. As she moved toward the door, the hallway beyond came alive. The wall of cameras was waiting, hungry, relentless, blinding. Flash bulbs burst like lightning against storm glass. Dozens of microphones stretched toward her like a firing squad of wires and foam. "Ms. Owens, do you deny foreign funding?" someone shouted. "Did you knowingly mislead the public?" cried another. "Do you stand by your Ukraine statements? Are you cooperating with the next phase of the investigation? Do you regret what you said about nurses and BLM?" The questions collided, stacked, echoed, each one sharper than the last. Owens said nothing. She walked forward, her pace tight and clipped, her jaw clenched with mechanical control. For years, she had thrived in front of these very lenses, commanding the spotlight, bending questions to her frame, redirecting scrutiny into spectacle. But not today. The optics had changed. The lights didn't worship anymore. They interrogated. And the silence around her was no longer deference. It was indictment. Her team followed closely behind, eyes down, mouths closed. Her lead attorney whispered something to her left ear. She didn't respond. She didn't flinch. But the moment she crossed the threshold into the marble corridor, the momentum was no longer hers. Aides passed her hurriedly. Journalists paced beside her like sharks. Even the Capitol security detail, usually stoic, kept glancing toward her as if watching a building crack in real time. Across the globe, her exit streamed live. CNN's lower third read, Owens silent as hearing ends in stunning turn. BBC World, Owens faces congressional inquiry expansion. Al Jazeera, right-wing commentator Crumbles under congressional fire. But she didn't stop. She couldn't, because every step she took outside that room wasn't an escape. It was a retreat through broken glass. Back inside, Crockett remained seated, quietly collecting her notes, untouched by the chaos erupting outside. Her face bore no pride, only resolve. She had not aimed to humiliate. She had aimed to reveal. And she had. Not just the contradictions in Owens's narrative, but the frailty of an entire ecosystem built on manipulated outrage, paid provocation, and deniability for sale. There were no arrests that day, no handcuffs, no pounding of fists. But something far greater had occurred. Credibility had cracked in real time. And once trust breaks, especially under lights in front of millions, it cannot be reassembled with spin. Not even by someone as practiced as Candace Owens. Because this was no longer about a single figure. It was about a machine. And the moment the nation realized that the machine had a manual, had a motive, and above all had a maker who refused to answer for it, that machine didn't collapse all at once. But as Candace Owens vanished into the swarm of unanswered questions and unyielding cameras, its shell splintered, publicly, painfully, permanently. And though the hearing adjourned, the real work had just begun. The story wasn't over. But the empire of deception had cracked, and the light had found its way in. As the doors closed behind Candace Owens, and the glare of the cameras dimmed into distant echoes, the room was left not just with silence, but with something more permanent, the moral residue of what had just unfolded, and a lesson written not in law, but in consequence. There are moments in history when truth arrives not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet reckoning, slow, patient, irreversible. This was one of those moments, and within that chamber, where numbers had been wielded like blades, video had been stripped of its edits, and silence had screamed louder than sound. Something deeper than politics had been revealed. The world had just witnessed what happens when influence is mistaken for integrity, when a platform becomes a weapon, and when free speech is used not to liberate, but to manipulate. Jasmine Crockett hadn't won a debate. She had exposed a system, and not with fury, but with evidence. Not by shouting over noise, but by forcing noise to face the mirror. In doing so, she laid bare a lesson that had nothing to do with partisanship, and everything to do with responsibility. That words are not without gravity. They land, they linger, and sometimes they destroy. But the human lesson didn't belong to the committee. It belonged to the people who had suffered in silence long before cameras were ever turned on. It belonged to the nurse who still woke at night with spit on her cheek and fear in her gut. It belonged to the teachers, doctors, frontline workers, immigrants, and black citizens who had been turned into targets by manufactured doubt. It belonged to the audiences who had been fed fear disguised as clarity, anger sold as empowerment. The hearing had revealed not only that misinformation had been monetized, but that its collateral damage had faces, names, and pain that didn't fit into trending hashtags. And the lesson wasn't just that Owens had gone too far. It was that she had been allowed to, until truth caught up. The moment forced a confrontation that America had long avoided, the difference between speech that challenges and speech that corrodes. Freedom of expression is a pillar of democracy, but it is not armor for deception. It is not immunity for malice. Crockett's line, "Truth does not need to shout," was more than a mic drop. It was a philosophy, one that declared that honesty does not require an audience to be valid, that decency does not need virality to have value, that real courage lies not in saying the most outrageous thing, but in standing accountable when the consequences come. For Candace Owens, the fallout wasn't just reputational, it was existential. Because when the applause fades, when the clicks dry up, when the brand loses its shine, all that's left is the ledger of what your voice truly built. And in her case, it wasn't community, it wasn't clarity, it wasn't truth. It was a scaffold of suspicion. It was a pipeline of chaos, disguised as commentary, protected by ambiguity, until someone like Crockett, armed only with facts and moral force, shattered the illusion. But the greater moral arc didn't end with her. It was about what we, as a society, permit when charisma overrides consequence. It was about what happens when doubt is industrialized, when platforms reward provocation over integrity, when entire ecosystems flourish by making people fear each other more than they understand each other. The hearing didn't just dismantle one narrative. It held up a mirror to the culture that allowed it to thrive. It reminded everyone watching that democracy cannot survive on spectacle alone. It requires truth. It demands it. And when truth is treated like an option instead of a foundation, even the loudest voices will eventually collapse under the silence of their own accountability. That day, as Jasmine Crockett packed her files and walked out without a press scrum, there was no headline screaming her name, no viral reel capturing her smile. But there was something else, the feeling, felt by millions, that honesty had finally stood up in a room that had long been under spin. And in that standing, a new standard had been drawn, not just for politicians or pundits or media moguls, but for all of us. The lesson was searing, simple, and non-negotiable. Influence without conscience is a loaded weapon, and silence in the face of consequence is its trigger. Truth may not trend, it may not sell, but it endures. And when spoken quietly under oath, in the face of power, it can bring even the loudest empire to its knees. As the gavel echoed its final strike, and the screens across America slowly dimmed, what lingered wasn't just scandal, it was a challenge, an open wound in the fabric of public truth that demanded more than observation. It demanded action. This wasn't a story that ended with a verdict. It began with a responsibility. Because every clip that went viral, every falsehood amplified, every truth buried beneath the noise wasn't just a byproduct of one woman's empire. It was the result of a system we all helped build, or at least allowed to grow unchecked. And now, as the dust settled in that Capitol hearing room, a larger question loomed like smoke in the rafters. What will you do with the truth now that it's no longer hidden? The time for spectatorship is over. Silence is no longer neutral. Every like, every share, every passively consumed soundbite is a vote, not just for content, but for the kind of country we allow to exist. We are not powerless in the face of misinformation. We are complicit if we remain passive. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose Candace Owens. She exposed how easy it is to turn rage into currency and how rarely we demand a receipt. But accountability cannot live in one courtroom or one hearing. It lives in every classroom, every platform, every conversation around the dinner table. If you're tired of being misled, if you've watched your community torn by false narratives, if you've lost someone to conspiracy before you lost them to illness, then this moment is yours too. You cannot change the algorithm, but you can change what you amplify. Refuse to share content that weaponizes identity and labels it truth. Demand transparency from every influencer, anchor, and elected official. Push for legislation that separates opinion from deception and holds purveyors of lies financially liable, not to stifle speech, but to stop weaponized distortion from parading as journalism. Fund media literacy in schools not as a luxury, but as a civic defense system. Make critical thinking louder than outrage. And most of all, vote. Not just in elections, but every day, with your clicks, your comments, your courage. The danger wasn't just Candace Owens. It was the vacuum of accountability around her. A vacuum created by platforms that reward engagement over ethics, by viewers addicted to confirmation, by lawmakers too afraid to lose followers to tell uncomfortable truths. That vacuum can only be filled by people who choose vigilance over convenience. If the line between speech and harm has been blurred, then it's up to us to redraw it, with action, with policy, and with personal conviction. This moment isn't about politics, it's about public safety. It's about choosing whether we want a society governed by data and deliberation, or by dopamine and division. Candace didn't invent outrage culture, but she mastered it. And in doing so, she reminded us of something dangerous. Truth dies not with a gunshot, but with a shrug. If we let falsehood fester because it's entertaining, if we excuse cruelty because it's clever, if we dismiss fact-checking as bias, we don't just lose the argument, we lose the republic. Now we stand at the edge of a different kind of war, not with bombs, but with bandwidth, not with armies, but with audiences. And in this battle, apathy is surrender. You don't need a podium to speak truth. You just need to stop feeding the lie. Cancel subscriptions that amplify misinformation. Write to your representatives and demand stronger protections against data manipulation and AI-enhanced disinformation campaigns. And yes, hold tech companies accountable for monetizing division. This hearing may be over, but your role in this isn't. Because there's a Candace in every feed, every algorithm, every whisper that turns into violence. She is not the last, but she can be the warning. Let her downfall serve as a blueprint, not for revenge, but for reconstruction. Let Crockett's quiet storm be a call, not for censorship, but for consequence. In the final analysis, this isn't about one woman's hypocrisy. It's about the price we all pay when we treat truth like an accessory instead of a foundation. If you felt the weight of that nurse's tears, the shiver in the silence that followed Crockett's question, the fury buried beneath those manipulated views, then you already know we can't afford to wait for another hearing. We are already the jury. So act, speak, investigate, question. Because truth doesn't just need defenders, it needs witnesses brave enough to stay awake when the spectacle fades. And in this era of engineered division, that may be the most radical form of patriotism left. But even as sweeping legislation and institutional reforms are debated, there's a quieter battlefield, one inside each of us. In a world saturated with curated outrage and algorithm-driven truth, the power to resist begins with something deceptively simple: self-awareness. Every time we click without questioning, every time we forward a headline without reading beyond it, we become unwitting cogs in the machine we claim to oppose. This is not a call for silence. It's a call for precision, to pause before we post, to ask, is this true, before we share, to recognize that freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence, and that amplifying harm, even unintentionally, still leaves fingerprints. The lies don't spread themselves. They are carried, pixel by pixel, by us. Jasmine Crockett's confrontation wasn't just about Candace Owens. It was a mirror, held up to a country that has, for too long, confused volume with truth, popularity with credibility. If we want to dismantle the empire of distortion, we don't just need hearings, we need habits. The kind that start in quiet moments when no one is watching, but truth is still at stake. Because in the end, democracy doesn't die in darkness. It dies in distraction. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. During a nationally broadcast political talk show in Austin, Texas, watched live by over 4 million Americans and replayed more than 28 million times online, Caroline Leavitt interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence, hurling words laced with disdain. Entitled, "Playing the Victim, Acting Like Everyone Owes Her." The moment hit the airwaves like a flashbang, blinding, loud, and impossible to ignore. But Jasmine didn't fire back with fury. She chose precision over volume. Days later, with 62 pages of damning evidence and a powerhouse civil rights attorney beside her, she launched a defamation lawsuit that sent shockwaves through the political world. Will Caroline pay the $100 million price or slip away untouched yet again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the floodlights of a live national broadcast in Austin, Texas, the stage was set for what was billed as a standard political roundtable. But the tension in the air said otherwise. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, her blazer sharp, her posture unshakable. The moderator asked a question about leadership in Congress, and Jasmine leaned forward, voice calm but resolute. "For women like me, there's no right tone," she said. "If I speak firmly, I'm labeled hostile. If I'm too quiet, I'm dismissed as unqualified. This is the burden of being both a woman and Black in American politics." The room stilled. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. But her words struck with the precision of a scalpel, cutting into the pretense of equality that coated the panel like stage makeup. Eyes shifted. Breaths were held. Caroline Leavitt's smirk formed before her reply even left her lips. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, a practiced sparkle in her tone. "Well, maybe," she said with exaggerated politeness. "If some people stopped playing the victim and started acting like real leaders, they'd get the respect they claim they're missing." A few chuckles flickered nervously from the audience. Caroline wasn't finished. "And honestly, Jasmine, it's not your skin color that makes people tune you out. It's this constant sense that the world owes you something. That's not leadership. That's entitlement." The moderator's eyes widened. The panelist to Caroline's left blinked, visibly stunned. Someone backstage whispered into a headset. But the director didn't cut. The moment was spiraling, yet Jasmine sat perfectly still. She reached forward and gently adjusted her mic, eyes locked on Caroline. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but it cut through the studio like a blade. "I don't need anyone to owe me anything." The silence was immediate. "I speak with purpose because I carry generations who never had the chance. And if that discomforts you, that's not my burden to fix." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't waver. But the entire room recoiled as if hit by a wave. Caroline sat back, blinking fast. For a moment, everything froze. The moderator, the cameras, even the live audience. And in that stillness, one truth rang louder than anything that had been said. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to shout to own the moment. The stillness in the studio didn't end when the cameras cut. It was merely the beginning. As the broadcast faded to commercial, the internet lit up with a ferocity that even the producers hadn't anticipated. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's poised rebuttal and Caroline Leavitt's smirking insult was ripped, reposted, and replayed across every major platform within the hour. On Twitter, it took less than 7 minutes for the video to reach 1 million views. On TikTok, creators began breaking down every second, analyzing Jasmine's silence, Caroline's tone, the raised eyebrow, the tilt of the microphone. Each frame became a battlefield of meaning. News anchors paused live segments to address what they called a seismic cultural moment. Commentators and educators weighed in, calling the exchange a textbook case of veiled hostility dressed in political civility. One civil rights attorney described it as gaslighting in real time under the warm glow of studio lights. Another called it the kind of moment that black women know by muscle memory, an ambush of credibility beneath a smile. The intensity of the reaction didn't come from the words alone, but from what they revealed. People weren't just hearing Caroline, they were recognizing her. They were recognizing the pattern, the tone that implies superiority without saying it, the feigned innocence of, I'm just being honest, the cold dismissal wrapped in a practiced grin. Viewers, especially women of color, described the experience of watching as visceral. One wrote, "It felt like being in the room again, the room where you're expected to smile through the insult because calling it out makes you the problem." Another said, "This wasn't a debate, it was domination by implication. The moment wasn't viral because it was shocking. It was viral because it was familiar. What Caroline said was not new. What was new was that Jasmine didn't flinch. And that stillness, the refusal to perform either anger or submission, left a nation breathless. But while the public dissected tone, history, and harm, Caroline Leavitt chose another path: defiance. When pressed by reporters the next morning outside a conservative talk show studio in Manhattan, she smiled like someone who thought the storm had passed. "I don't see what the big deal is," she said, holding her phone loosely in one hand. "I said what a lot of people are thinking. She just didn't want to hear it." The cameras caught everything: the shrug, the smirk, the dismissiveness. For her, this was still politics. For everyone else, it was personal. Educators began referencing the incident in classrooms. A psychology professor used it in a lecture about microaggressions in public discourse. A pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon around it. No one was debating whether Caroline's words were offensive. They were trying to understand why she believed they were acceptable, and her refusal to apologize, her insistence that it was just the truth, only deepened the wound. Jasmine Crockett said nothing in those first 24 hours. No press conferences, no tweets. But her silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It was weight. In a culture obsessed with instant reactions and digital clapbacks, Jasmine's restraint became the most powerful response of all. Because while Caroline thought she was winning the argument, the rest of the country was beginning to realize this wasn't an argument anymore. It was evidence. But silence doesn't shield the past. It awakens it. As Caroline Leavitt stood firm in her refusal to apologize, brushing off the incident as if it were a nuisance rather than a national flashpoint, the deeper reckoning began. Not with shouts, but with receipts. People weren't content with her explanation anymore. They wanted context, and what they uncovered wasn't a single misstep. It was a pattern, methodical and chilling. A podcast episode from 2021 resurfaced first. In it, Caroline mocked the concept of code switching, her tone smug, her laughter uninterrupted. "Just talk like a normal person," she said dismissively. "I don't need a black voice and a white voice. Just say what you mean." Her co-host had laughed along, but the audio didn't age quietly. It landed like a cold slap, especially for viewers who had spent their careers walking the tightrope of linguistic survival in rooms that never truly welcomed them. And then came the tweet. It wasn't an old one buried in the distant past. It was just 2 years prior. After Jasmine Crockett held a town hall on economic equity in Dallas, Caroline had tweeted, "Aggressive and ghetto in heels. Classic no context, no apology, just 5 words soaked in contempt." The post was deleted months later, but the internet forgets nothing. Screenshots reemerged with timestamps, archived links, and commentary from users who remembered feeling the sting even then. But more revealing than the words was the posture behind them. A pattern of reducing powerful black women to caricatures, of using coded language while hiding behind plausible deniability. It wasn't just cruelty, it was craft. And that craft, once exposed, told the real story. Caroline hadn't spoken from impulse. She had spoken from habit. The turning point came not from a journalist, but from someone who once sat quietly behind her. A former campaign aide, anonymous at first, later verified, delivered the bomb that rewrote the narrative. A string of internal emails, Slack messages, and debate prep documents painted a picture so precise, so disturbingly calculated, that it could no longer be explained away as coincidence. One email, dated 6 days before the broadcast, was labeled, Rapid response if race is mentioned. It advised, don't shut it down. Let it breathe, then discredit it. Say it's victimhood culture. Say it's divisive. Keep your tone calm, but make her look fragile. Another message went further. Use buzzwords, strong, tough love, real talk. Make it sound like concern, not attack. Then pivot hard to personal responsibility. These weren't talking points. They were traps, drawn in plain text, planned like a campaign, not to inform or challenge, but to provoke and diminish. The media latched on within hours. Headlines shifted from panel clash to planned gaslighting exposed. Legal analysts began calling it a textbook example of premeditated character assault. Professors of rhetoric held lectures analyzing Caroline's phrasing, inflection, and posture. The conclusion was unnerving. This wasn't about disagreement. It was about performance, executed with the intention to destabilize a black woman on live television while leaving just enough ambiguity to deny the intent. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, remained silent. But behind the walls of her office, a team of aides and legal minds worked late into the night. They weren't just collecting insults. They were collecting proof. Not for the court of public opinion, but for something far more permanent. Because when the insult is crafted with this much care, it becomes something more than offensive. It becomes admissible. But when humiliation is engineered, when every smirk is backed by a memo, and every insult is rehearsed in bullet points, then silence stops being graceful. It becomes a wound. Jasmine Crockett had carried that wound through years of hearings, interviews, and backroom politics, letting things slide, taking the high road, choosing composure over confrontation. But now the line had been crossed, clean, deliberate, and on live television. And this time there would be no retreat. Behind the tinted windows of her Dallas office, the mood was electric with focus. The air itself seemed sharper. Every surface was covered in paper, annotated transcripts, authenticated screenshots, deposition offers, phone logs. Jasmine stood over the table like a strategist at war. This wasn't about an insult anymore. This was about the infrastructure of disrespect and dismantling it piece by piece. Brandon Keyes sat across from her, laptop open, glasses low on his nose, scanning the final draft of the legal complaint. His style wasn't loud. He never raised his voice, but every word he spoke felt like the chamber before a gunshot. Precise, quiet, unstoppable. 63 pages, he said without looking up, with hard proof, time-stamped motive, and chain of command intent. This isn't just defamation. It's professional sabotage. Jasmine nodded once. She didn't need a pep talk. She'd spent the last week rewatching the footage of Caroline's smirk, rereading the internal memos, remembering the look in the moderator's eyes when the room froze. None of it surprised her, but all of it mattered now. Brandon turned the screen toward her. Once you sign this, he said, everything changes. We don't just step into the arena. We turn the lights on. That afternoon, she walked into the briefing room without security or statement cards. Just her, a microphone, and the storm she was about to command. Reporters were already waiting, the room packed shoulder to shoulder, the hum of news cameras growing louder by the second. Jasmine stepped up to the podium with the composure of someone who had held her breath for too long and was finally ready to exhale. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't blink. This lawsuit, she began, is not about outrage. It's about accountability. And more than that, it's about setting a standard. Because if we keep moving the goalposts for what disrespect looks like, we'll wake up in a world where dignity is optional. The room went quiet. She let it settle before finishing. We need to draw a line, a real one, between disagreement and degradation. And this is where I draw mine. She didn't wait for applause. She turned, walked out, and let the weight of her words hang like the sound of a gavel in a silent room. But drawing the line doesn't just shift the conversation. It forces the mask to fall. The moment Jasmine Crockett filed her lawsuit, a quiet ripple moved through the power corridors Caroline Leavitt once walked so easily. But by dawn the next day, that ripple had become a full-scale retreat. Corporate sponsors, many of whom had stood by her through smaller controversies, began pulling contracts without ceremony. A wellness brand known for empowering women through bold voices terminated their partnership via a terse one-line email. A podcast network removed her episode archive, replacing it with a placeholder that simply read "under review." Her literary agent, once fiercely loyal, left a voicemail that ended with, "We can't move forward together, Caroline." It's not personal, it's pattern. Even her calendar, once filled with speaking tours and network appearances, began to clear itself, as if the universe were wiping her off the slate. Still, Caroline didn't flinch, at least not in public. That evening, she set up her home camera, applied studio lighting, and went live on her personal streaming page. Framed by carefully placed props, a Constitution print, an American flag, a biography of Reagan, she stared into the lens with defiance sharpened into performance. Her voice was clipped, performative, the tone of someone convinced the world was overreacting. "I poke her," she said with a half smile, "and she sues me? Are we really doing this?" She laughed, casually sipping from a mug that read, "Unapologetic." But her attempt to minimize the lawsuit collapsed before she even ended the stream. The clip was cut mid-laugh, posted by a journalist, and then duplicated across a dozen major platforms within minutes. What might have once been brushed off as bravado now read as something else. Contempt. For boundaries, for accountability, for the damage she'd caused. But the real tremor came not from media, but from inboxes. That same night, Jasmine's legal office received a message marked urgent, former staff. It was short, unsigned, but direct. "She's done this before. I can prove it." The attachments that followed were chilling. Email chains from campaign strategy sessions, debate prep notes, bullet points targeting specific progressive women of color with language designed to provoke. One slide, labeled "De-escalation through dominance," advised speakers to use calm condescension to trigger emotional responses. Another noted, "Don't insult race directly, suggest weakness, hypersensitivity, let the audience connect the dots." It was a weaponized instruction manual for gaslighting, hiding behind smiles and faux concern. And more messages followed. A former production assistant sent over audio from a team huddle where Caroline laughed about breaking Crockett on air. Another described a workshop where interns role-played confrontation tactics. These weren't whispers. They were floodgates opening. For Jasmine, each new document was confirmation of what she had always felt, but had never been allowed to say without being accused of paranoia. Now the proof was laid bare, cold, calculated, and cruel. What the world had seen in a 43-second clip was not a misstep. It was the final act of a performance long in the making. Caroline hadn't just crossed a line. She had built a stage over it. And now the lights were on, the audience was watching, and every co-star she had trained to stay silent was stepping forward, script in hand, ready to testify. But when the stage collapses and the mask is gone, what remains is the echo. Echoes that ripple far beyond politics, reaching places power never planned for. As Caroline's world unraveled in boardrooms and inboxes, another world was stirring, quietly, deliberately, and with a weight far more enduring than hashtags or headlines. In a public high school on the south side of Milwaukee, a government teacher dimmed the lights and cued the now infamous footage. Jasmine Crockett sitting steady, while Caroline delivered the smirk-laced insult seen around the world. The class watched in silence. No commentary, no dramatic narration, just raw, uninterrupted reality. When it ended, the teacher didn't speak. A student, maybe 16, finally broke the stillness. Why is the calm one always the one expected to explain herself? That single question turned into a classroom-wide reflection. They weren't just studying political speech anymore. They were deconstructing coded power. And suddenly, Jasmine wasn't a headline. She was curriculum. The movement spread without banners. Across the country, teachers downloaded lesson plans titled Tone, Power, and Race in Modern Discourse. AP English students in Atlanta were assigned essays not on Shakespeare, but on Crockett's silence, asked to analyze restraint as rhetoric, dignity as resistance. In Queens, a substitute teacher who rarely spoke in staff meetings requested to lead a session on linguistic bias in televised debate, using Jasmine's exchange as the foundation. Schools began organizing assemblies, not to talk about the lawsuit, but about how language carries implication long after the microphone is off. And everywhere in notes passed, essays typed, and journals scribbled in lockers, Jasmine Crockett's name became shorthand for a kind of power that had no slogan, only presence. Not everyone agreed with her politics, but almost no one could deny what she represented now, a refusal to be reduced. In a small church on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, the sermon took an unexpected turn. Reverend Marcus Eldridge, a 62-year-old pastor with a voice like gravel and smoke, paused mid-prepared scripture. He reached behind the pulpit and held up a still image from the panel broadcast, a freeze frame of Jasmine's face, right after Caroline's last jab. "This," he said slowly, "is what it looks like when a woman carries centuries in her spine." No one in the congregation breathed. This is what it means to walk into a room already under suspicion and still refuse to fold. The congregation didn't shout. They didn't clap. They sat with it, deeply. That moment was recorded, uploaded, and by Monday it had been played in more than 30 churches from Oakland to Tallahassee. Not because it was viral, but because it was gospel. Jasmine had become more than a figure in a suit. She had become a reflection of everything power tried to silence and everything history had failed to reckon with. Meanwhile, local governments began taking notice. In Newark, the city council opened a session with a motion to implement respectful discourse training for all public employees. One councilwoman stood and declared, "We will not wait for the courts to decide what dignity looks like. We've already seen it." In Minneapolis, a civic youth leadership program restructured its spring curriculum to include a unit titled Power and Poise, Public Silence as Political Strength. Jasmine's photo now sat beside quotes from Maya Angelou and Shirley Chisholm, not as a political figure, but as an example of modern restraint with historic gravity. Community centers held panels. University classrooms assigned her posture as primary text. And all the while, Jasmine Crockett herself had not made a single public comment since the suit was filed. She didn't need to, because everywhere her name appeared, in books, in bulletins, on murals, the message was already clear. Her silence was not absence. It was defiance made visible. But when silence becomes a symbol, the next sound the world waits for is justice. And on the morning the trial began, the air around the Harris County Courthouse didn't feel like a legal proceeding. It felt like the opening scene of a national reckoning. Steel barricades lined the sidewalk. Reporters shouted into wind-blown microphones as satellite vans hummed behind them. 18 television cameras were stationed across the courtroom, like sentinels, flanked by dozens of still photographers from national and international media. Courtroom seats were claimed before sunrise. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera were all on site, broadcasting live. The nation wasn't just watching, it was holding its breath. The debate that had once been framed as just politics was now on trial in the formality of wood-paneled silence and sworn testimony. But if the room was tense, it cracked the moment the doors opened. Caroline Leavitt entered first. Her heels struck the marble floor like applause. Dressed in navy, chin high, she gave a clipped nod to the gallery, her smile rehearsed, her walk deliberate. It was the swagger of someone still convinced this was performance, not consequence. Her lawyers flanked her, briefcases in hand, faces tightened with the subtle panic of men who'd read too many op-eds in too few depositions. Caroline sat, crossed her legs, and flashed a grin toward the press section. Then came Jasmine. No entourage, no glances to the crowd. She stepped in quietly, wearing a matte gray suit and no jewelry, as if to strip the moment of anything but purpose. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was immovable. She did not smile. She did not blink. She sat down at the plaintiff's table and placed a single pen beside her case folder, then folded her hands with the calm of someone who no longer had anything to prove. Judge Ellis Rawlins, a man known for his zero-tolerance courtroom and fondness for direct language, took his seat with a stern expression sharpened by years of high-profile trials. He glanced once across the room, then brought down the gavel. The air shifted. "Let the record reflect," he said, voice low but resonant. "This court recognizes the extraordinary public attention on this matter, but attention does not equal influence. This will be a trial under law, not opinion." And with that, the process began. Jury selection followed. No formality spared, no voice left untested. Each juror was questioned not just on their politics, but their understanding of coded language, public narrative, and bias. It was meticulous, exhausting, but necessary, because what was being tried here wasn't just defamation. It was dignity, and who gets to define it? But in the arena of accountability, defense by distortion is a familiar game, and Caroline's legal team played it with all the polish of seasoned tacticians, but none of the moral weight. On the second day of trial, as the courthouse swelled with spectators and cameras rolled from the press balcony, Caroline's lead attorney, Mitchell Graves, rose with theatrical calm. Tall, silver-templed, and known for his flair in front of juries, he moved deliberately to the center of the room, thumbs hooked inside his blazer. "This," he said, gesturing to the plaintiff's table, where Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving, "is not a case of malice. It is a case of misunderstanding. My client expressed a political opinion. That is not defamation. That is democracy." His voice was smooth, but his rhythm calculated. He wasn't speaking to the judge. He was performing for the 12 pairs of eyes in the jury box, hoping to invoke the well-worn refuge of free speech without reckoning with the cost of its abuse. Then came the screens. With a soft click, the defense triggered a video compilation, and the courtroom dimmed as a massive monitor lit up with edited footage. Jasmine, in various committee rooms and press conferences, appeared forceful, unyielding, animated. One clip showed her raising her voice during a tense floor debate. Another caught her sharply interrupting a fellow representative. "Is this the voice of someone silenced?" Graves asked, turning to the jury. "Or the voice of someone accustomed to confrontation?" The question hung in the air like smoke. He didn't wait for an answer. More clips rolled. Fast cuts, abrupt transitions, each selected to portray Jasmine not as a target of defamation, but as a political brawler. But what the defense didn't show, and what the courtroom didn't forget, were the missing seconds. The moments before Jasmine raised her voice. The provocations, the insults, the interruptions. The rooms that treated her as a guest rather than a peer. Outside the courthouse, the narrative didn't land as cleanly as Graves had hoped. Legal commentators began issuing real-time rebuttals, pausing the edited clips side by side with the originals. A constitutional law professor from Howard called the tactic weaponized context collapse, adding, "When you amputate the cause and only present the reaction, you're not seeking clarity, you're selling caricature." Social media echoed the sentiment. Viewers weren't just watching a trial, they were watching a familiar story. A black woman's strength being mislabeled as aggression, her clarity twisted into combativeness, her composure punished because it couldn't be controlled. Comment threads filled with stories, professionals, students, activists, all recalling the moment they too had been told their voice was too much, simply for being heard. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She sat like stone, because she didn't need to prove she had been misrepresented. The defense was doing it for her, one clip at a time. But when distortion gives way to documentation, the temperature in the courtroom changes, not with fire, but with cold precision. Brandon Keyes didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or posture. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom, paused, and opened a black binder so thick it looked like a case file from a federal prosecution. The words he spoke next weren't dramatic. They were devastating. "What the defense calls opinion," he said, voice smooth as glass, "was rehearsed provocation, and I will prove that, line by line." Then the screens lit up. The first message appeared. Plain, unstyled, undeniable. It was a Slack conversation from Caroline Levitt's media team, dated 3 days before the Austin broadcast. "She'll probably bring up systemic bias. Let her. That's when we pivot. Make it sound like she's making excuses." Another reply followed. "People are tired of race talk. Let her walk into that. You just look annoyed and rational." Brandon let the silence breathe. He didn't editorialize. He let the jury read it for themselves. Then came the emails. Emails with subject lines like panel talking points. Provocation angle, race pivot triggers, weakness language, test phrases. One line in bold, pulled from an internal prep doc, read, "Smirk when she invokes history, makes her sound rehearsed." The courtroom didn't gasp. It sank, slowly, inexorably. It was no longer a question of whether the insult was cruel. It was a question of how long they had planned to make it look accidental. Then Brandon played the tape. The audio, recovered from a hot mic before the show began, was barely cleaned up. It didn't need to be. Caroline's voice was unmistakable. "If she goes into trauma mode, I'll keep it light. Flip it on her. They hate that." A male voice, likely a producer, laughed in the background. "Gonna bait her again?" Caroline replied, low but clear. "That's the point." There was no context to misread, no framing to dispute, just intention, raw, casual, and cruel. Brandon didn't speak again. He clicked the recording off, stepped aside, and called his next witness. A television producer took the stand, shoulders square, jaw tense, hands locked together like she'd been holding something in for too long. "I was there that day," she began. "I saw the prep documents. I saw the call sheets. But none of that included what she said on air. That moment wasn't off script. It was a script we were never shown." Her voice never broke, but her conviction was volcanic. That smirk wasn't spontaneous. That tone wasn't off the cuff. "I've produced live TV for 17 years, and I've never seen someone so calmly weaponize subtle racism with that much accuracy." And then, perhaps most chilling of all, came the intern. 24 years old, nervous, pale, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded a copy of a training memo. "I was assigned to her communications team during the state circuit," he said. "This is what we were told to study." He held up the paper. On screen, the jury saw its title projected in block font: "Tactics for Undermining Minority Opposition, Engage, Control, Reframe." And beneath it, bullet points: clinical, rehearsed, soulless. Look for phrases like community, history, or representation. Respond with responsibility, leadership, or victim culture. If the subject is female and black, allow her to build emotional momentum, then counter with a calm, dismissive tone. This creates visual dominance without verbal aggression. By the time he finished reading, the courtroom was frozen, not in confusion, but in clarity. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to testify that she had been targeted. The strategy to do so had already been printed, shared, and taught like doctrine. And now it stood exposed under oath, under light, under the unbearable weight of truth. But when planning becomes cruelty, and cruelty becomes casual, the courtroom stops being a legal chamber. It becomes a reckoning. The atmosphere was already dense from the prior revelations, but what followed shattered whatever emotional shield remained. Brandon Keyes stood at the center of the room, voice low, unwavering. "Our next witness," he said, "will not show you more strategy. She will show you consequence." Then he gestured gently toward the side door. The woman who stepped into the room didn't wear power like armor. She wore something far heavier: regret, truth, and a quiet kind of bravery. Her name was redacted for privacy, but the pain on her face needed no introduction. She took the stand slowly, her hands shaking as she raised them to be sworn in. Her eyes, already glossy with tears, never rose to meet Caroline's. "I was Caroline Levitt's communications assistant for 10 months, she began, voice barely above a whisper. "I was young, hungry. I thought I was building a career." Then her voice wavered. "But I wasn't building anything. I was helping sharpen weapons." She described the meeting that broke her, the one behind a closed door, just 5 days before the infamous panel. "Caroline looked me straight in the eye and said, 'Have a few personal lines ready in case Jasmine starts that race stuff. Keep it slick. Don't make it sound rehearsed.'" The words cracked something open. She paused, a single tear trailing down her cheek. "She wanted me to write insults in advance, to make them feel spontaneous. That was the assignment, and I did it, until I couldn't anymore." She reached into a file and handed Brandon a printed sheet. He held it up so the jury could read. The header read, "Counterpunch responses, if race is raised." The bullet points were short, clean, brutal. "Leadership isn't about trauma. Don't ask for a seat at the table if you won't bring substance. Maybe earn respect before demanding it." Each line crafted not to challenge ideas, but to undercut identity, to humiliate with a smile. "I wrote those," she said, choking on the words. "She used pieces of them on air. I watched her do it. And I left that job 3 days later because I couldn't keep being part of it." She stopped, trembling now, but lifted her face. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I saw someone get targeted with something I helped build, and I want to tear it down." Then Brandon turned slowly and gave a subtle nod to the audio technician. What followed wasn't a scream. It wasn't even loud, but it was the most disturbing sound the courtroom had heard. From a backstage studio mic, never meant to be public, Caroline's voice spilled out, easy and amused. "I get these emails from angry black lady politicians all the time. So dramatic. I save the worst ones. It's free content, baby." The laughter in the background wasn't forced. It was familiar, routine, like they'd heard the line before. The room went still, so still, even the clicking of pens stopped. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keys. One juror visibly swallowed. Another clenched their jaw. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't blink. She didn't break. She just looked ahead, her silence holding more force than the voices that had tried to define her. This wasn't political theater anymore. It was a slow-motion exposure of cruelty, designed, rehearsed, monetized, and for the first time laid bare without disguise. But once humiliation has been dissected under oath, and manipulation no longer hides behind charm, the courtroom shifts from theater to verdict. For 3 full days, the jury deliberated in silence so thick it felt like the walls were listening. 12 strangers, diverse in age, race, and politics, now carried the weight of a national moment in their hands. They were shown not just a legal case, but a slow-motion assault masked as commentary, a campaign of calculated condescension dressed up in media polish. Behind closed doors, they reviewed everything: the emails, the training memos, the smirks, the laughter. They listened again to the tape of Caroline saying, "It's free content, baby." And they didn't ask what it meant. They asked how many people laughed before anyone said it was wrong. They were shown not one act of cruelty, but the repeat offense of indifference. And they understood. This wasn't just a slip. It was a system, personified. At exactly 4:17 p.m. on the third day, the jury filed in. The tension in the courtroom wasn't spoken. It was inhaled, held, suspended like breath under ice. Jasmine sat still, her palms flat against the table, her expression unreadable. Caroline sat 4 seats away, staring straight ahead, her attorney whispering something she didn't appear to hear. The foreman stood, voice steady but with a strain that betrayed the gravity of what he carried. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," he began. A beat passed. "We further find that the defendant, Caroline Levitt, engaged in willful and malicious defamation with evidence of targeted conduct using media platforms to publicly humiliate, professionally sabotage, and emotionally distress the plaintiff." It wasn't just a verdict, it was a declaration. This happened, and we saw it. Then came the damages. The courtroom, bracing for the original $80 million claim, sat in suspended disbelief as the foreman read the adjusted sum aloud. $100 million. The number wasn't inflated, it was justified. Enhanced by the weight of documentation, of witness testimony, of emotional trauma that couldn't be quantified, but had to be acknowledged. The figure included damages for reputational destruction, loss of public trust, and psychological harm tied not to a single insult, but to a deliberate campaign. This wasn't accountability by suggestion, it was accountability by force. Because some lines are so often crossed, the only way to redraw them is with something irreversible. Caroline didn't blink. She didn't cry. But something in her collapsed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but inwardly. The way a building folds when its foundation silently gives way. Her hands were clenched, her jaw tight, but the facade was gone. The room saw her, not the pundit, not the performer, just the architect of her own undoing. Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't move for several seconds. When she finally turned, she didn't lift her chin or close her eyes or savor the moment. She simply reached out and gripped Brandon Key's hand. No words, no triumph. Just a quiet, grounding gesture between two people who had walked through fire and brought back the truth. And in that stillness, there was no gloating, only gravity. Because this was never about winning. It was about refusing to lose in silence. And when justice is finally spoken aloud, not whispered, not bargained for, but declared in full by 12 impartial voices, what follows is not celebration, it is aftermath. The gavel fell. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to exhale. Even the marble floors seemed reluctant to echo the footsteps of history. Outside the courthouse, barricades lined the wide stone steps like ribs protecting a national moment. Press vans blocked 3 lanes of traffic. Cameramen climbed rooftops for a clean shot. Protest signs and bouquets of sunflowers gathered at the gates like offerings left at the edge of a storm. But the air itself, the air waited. And then the doors opened. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't a roar. It was silence, charged with voltage. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the light. No entourage. No aides waving her forward. Just her. One woman against 1,000 lenses. The sun struck her black blazer and made it look like polished obsidian. Her heels didn't click. They landed. Measured, slow. The sound of decision in motion. Reporters surged but didn't dare shout. Microphones hovered but found no voice. America had just watched a courtroom transform into a reckoning chamber. And now it waited to see what the woman at the center of it all would say. But Jasmine said nothing. Not a word. Not even a glance at the cameras. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't posture. She looked ahead and through. Her eyes scanned the distance as if she were still in that courtroom, still hearing that recording, still weighing the cost of being both the target and the proof. And what the world saw in that stare wasn't triumph. It was clarity, a gaze forged by being dismissed, gaslit, and dehumanized. Then standing anyway. There are some victories too sacred for sound bites, some pain too eloquent for microphones. Jasmine Crockett understood that, and so she let her silence say everything. In that moment, 100 news stations held their breath. CNN replayed the walk 5 times in an hour. MSNBC looped it with no commentary, calling it the stare heard across America. Fox tried to interpret it as political theater, until their legal analyst interrupted. That's not theater. That's the weight of a verdict resting in a woman's bones. TikTok clips layered her walk with Nina Simone's "Feeling Good." Twitter exploded with a single frame. Jasmine looking to the horizon, her jaw clenched, her soul exposed but unbroken. One user captioned it, "She didn't win. She endured. That's bigger." And people agreed, not in hashtags but in silence. A silence that understood what it meant to survive character assassination with dignity intact. As Jasmine descended the final step, someone in the crowd broke protocol, not by yelling, but by whispering just loud enough to be heard by the microphones. "Thank you for not letting them erase you." Jasmine didn't stop, but her shoulders shifted, just barely, as if that one sentence had caught the wind behind her and pushed it through her spine. Brandon Keyes followed a few paces behind, his tie loose, eyes still alert like a soldier waiting for aftershocks. But even he didn't speak. It wasn't time for statements. It was time for presence. Meanwhile, Caroline Levitt had exited quietly through a side door under the advice of counsel. No cameras, no statement, no contrition, just a black SUV, tinted windows, and the muffled slamming of a career folding into the shadows. She was gone before the verdict trended, before the soundbite surfaced, before America realized that what just happened wasn't the fall of a pundit. It was the exposure of an industry built on cruelty disguised as commentary, and Jasmine had walked straight through it. The cameras didn't blink. They zoomed, they followed. They clung to every frame of her retreat, not because they needed another quote, but because the silence itself had become historic. When she reached the edge of the crowd, a small child, no older than 7, broke through a loose gap in the barricade. The girl wore a pink jacket and carried a paper sign that read, "My voice matters too." Security stepped forward, unsure. But Jasmine paused, just for a second. Her eyes met the girl's. She didn't bend down. She didn't speak. But she raised her hand, just slightly, and touched 2 fingers to her chest, then pointed to the girl's heart. A gesture, a legacy. a vow passed from one generation to the next without a single word. Back in the newsroom control rooms, editors debated whether to cut the footage or let it roll. The consensus came quickly. Let it breathe. And so, for the first time in years, primetime news featured 60 full seconds of silence. No overlays, no pundits. Just Jasmine Crockett walking, alone, powerful, unshaken, not a martyr, not a victor. A woman who had faced mockery, not just in media but in method, who had been labeled angry, dramatic, inferior, and answered with truth so sharp it turned courts into mirrors. One anchor whispered it best. Some moments are too honest for language. That was the gaze Jasmine gave to America as she disappeared into the car waiting at the curb. She wasn't asking to be celebrated. She wasn't asking for redemption. She had never asked for anything but to be heard without having her humanity distorted. And now that the verdict had settled, and the nation had seen the blueprint for how degradation is monetized and normalized, her eyes offered only one final question. What will you do with what you now know? Then the door closed. The car pulled away, and the silence left behind wasn't empty. It was sacred. It was earned. And the world watching finally understood. You don't need to shout to be unforgettable. You just have to survive with your dignity louder than their lies. But the silence Jasmine left behind did not linger long. It transformed, first into whispers, then headlines, then declarations. Not of celebration, but of reckoning. Because when a black woman leaves a courtroom with $100 million in damages awarded for the humiliation she endured, the question isn't just about what she proved, it's about what we allowed. And that question spread like fire through the marrow of a nation that had grown used to calling cruelty just opinion. The morning after the verdict, the doors of every major civil rights organization opened early. From the NRACP's glass-walled press room in Baltimore to the legal roundtables at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, emails surged with a single theme. This was a case study, yes, but more than that, it was a signal. A signal that boundaries long ignored were finally visible again. A signal that dehumanizing someone on air, for sport and ratings, now came with consequence. At exactly 9:03 a.m., the National Civil Rights Forum held a press conference streamed live on 6 networks. The room was packed wall to wall with attorneys, pastors, journalists, and young organizers wearing buttons that read, "Dignity is not up for debate." Chairwoman Darlene Voss approached the podium, not with notes but with resolve. Her voice was low, deliberate, the kind that doesn't rise to be heard because the truth in it does the work. "Let us be clear," she said. "What happened in that courtroom was not just about defamation. It was not just about politics. It was about drawing a line, in ink, in law, and in memory, between disagreement and degradation." The applause was not explosive. It was solemn, as if the room had been holding its breath for years. Other groups followed swiftly. The Urban Justice Collective posted a photo of Jasmine walking down the courthouse steps, captioned, "She walked out, but she left the door open behind her, for everyone still fighting to be seen." Color of Change issued a formal statement titled Beyond the Verdict, urging policymakers to address how media systems profit off racial dog whistles and targeted humiliation. The Congressional Black Caucus, usually slow to weigh in on lawsuits, released an uncharacteristically personal message. To witness dignity weaponized as vulnerability and turned into content, then finally confronted in court, is to witness more than justice. It is to witness history correcting itself. But it was a lesser-known group from Atlanta, the Bailey Initiative for Media Ethics, that delivered the line heard around the country. In an emergency panel held on public radio, Executive Director Omar Glenn leaned into the mic, voice raw from a sleepless night. "This is not a legal win," he said. "This is a moral one. This is not about what the court allowed. It's about what we finally stopped tolerating." Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She held up a mirror and made us all look. That quote traveled faster than the verdict itself. By noon, it was plastered across the morning shows, TikTok slideshows, and pulsing across Times Square on the Reuters board. College campuses updated their digital billboards. Not a legal win, a moral one. Churches quoted it in bulletins. Influencers stitched it into videos. It wasn't a slogan, it was a confession. The confession of a culture that had laughed too often when it should have listened. That had said it's just politics when it was actually humiliation. That had confused free speech with free cruelty. And as those words echoed, news stories began to surface. People who had been targets in their own fields but never had the cameras to prove it. A black anchor in St. Louis resigned after finding a leaked email from her station director suggesting she wear her hair less urban during prime time. A Latina lawmaker shared screenshots from a group chat where opponents debated how to bait her into a meltdown on air. These weren't isolated events, they were symptoms. And Jasmine Crockett's case had pulled the curtain back. More than 50 legal scholars signed on to a joint article titled "The Cost of Being Heard, Defamation, Identity, and Digital Warfare," calling for new federal standards on televised political speech and the right to redress after reputational harm. Law students across the country requested to study Crockett versus Levitt as a model for balancing First Amendment protections with ethical media conduct. One of the co-authors, Dr. Malik Thompson, told NPR, "This verdict may become what New York Times versus Sullivan was in 1964, a new stake in the ground about public discourse and human dignity." Yet even as institutions rushed to contextualize the case, grassroots organizers were doing something deeper, reclaiming the silence Jasmine wielded as a tool of resistance. They began hosting dignity walks, events where Black women marched in silence through courthouses, media centers, and local governments, dressed in black, with their mouths covered by gold tape that read, "Unbothered, unmoved, unapologetic." Photos from Detroit, Philadelphia, and Oakland flooded social media. One caption read, "We walk like Jasmine. We speak when it's time, and when we don't, we make the silence louder than the insult." But the story wasn't just shaping the nation, it was reshaping language. For years, phrases like "playing the victim," "too sensitive," "just banter" had gone unchecked in political commentary. After the verdict, newsrooms began re-examining editorial guidelines. Anchors caught themselves mid-sentence and corrected. Panelists previously praised for being blunt were now asked, "Liv, are you being blunt or are you demeaning someone?" It was subtle, but it was seismic, because one woman's courtroom silence had recalibrated the sound of public decency. Even school districts responded. Several high schools in Georgia and Maryland announced curriculum changes to include discussions on coded language, tone policing, and identity-driven microaggressions. A middle school teacher in Texas posted a letter on Reddit, later reposted by thousands, that read, "Today my students asked if respect had a price tag. I told them no, but it has a courtroom now, and that's a start." In an unplanned press huddle outside a community center, civil rights icon Reverend Alicia Boone was asked whether she saw the case as precedent. She paused, her cane leaning against a rusted bench, and said softly, "Precedent is what the court gives you, but permission, that's what women like Jasmine give us. Permission to push back, permission to say, this is not how I will be spoken to, not here, not again." The camera caught her wiping away a tear, and America, still bruised from a culture that had for too long praised sharp tongues and punished quiet strength, began to understand. This wasn't about one verdict. It was about restoring the price of disrespect. Because Jasmine Crockett never asked to become a symbol. She simply refused to disappear. And in doing so, she forced a nation to confront what it has always struggled to admit, that some of our most applauded voices were never bold. They were cruel. That some of our most silent souls were never weak. They were just tired of being interrupted. And this time, when a woman said nothing, everyone finally listened. And just as swiftly as the nation spoke Jasmine's name in reverence, it began whispering Caroline's in disbelief. There was no press conference, no carefully worded statement from a publicist, no tearful live stream or last-minute defense, only silence, cold, mechanical, absolute. It began with a single refresh. At 6:04 a.m., a political analyst in Washington tried to pull up Caroline Levitt's podcast for a morning segment. It was gone. The Future Right, once a top 10 show among conservative youth, returned a 404 error. The RSS feed was stripped bare. No archive, no notice. At first, people assumed it was a server glitch. By 6:12 a.m., her official Twitter profile, a page that once averaged 3 viral tweets a day, vanished without warning. No no profile picture. Just a blank page with the message, "This account doesn't exist." Then came her Instagram, then YouTube, then her personal website, all wiped within a window so tight, cybersecurity experts on Reddit began theorizing whether this was a coordinated takedown. But it wasn't. It was a shutdown, voluntary, controlled, and panicked. By 6:30 a.m., internet sleuths noticed something chilling. Every trace of Caroline's digital voice was vanishing in reverse order, from most recent to oldest. Commentaries disappeared mid-scroll. Captions on political clips were replaced with blank metadata. Even tags on old debate videos were being removed as if her algorithmic fingerprints were being erased by someone inside the house. News anchors struggled to explain it live. "This is unprecedented," one host on MSNBC stammered. "We've seen people deplatformed, but not like this. Not someone vanishing by choice. Not this fast." On Fox News, the silence was even louder. By 7:10 a.m., they cut away from their usual political coverage entirely, opting to show weather maps and traffic congestion instead of addressing the storm unraveling in their own ranks. Behind the scenes, her sponsors were already gone. Overnight, payment processors suspended her accounts. The data trail was clear. Large brands and ad firms had received hundreds of emails demanding disassociation within minutes of the verdict. One internal memo from her former merchandise partner leaked, "No contract clause can survive this. Pull every SKU now." And they did. Shopify stores, closed. Patreon, empty. Her likeness scrubbed from affiliate banners, thumbnails replaced with stock images. It wasn't just a fall from grace, it was a controlled demolition. Some of her former allies tried to defend her, tried to say it was cancel culture, tried to spin the verdict as judicial overreach. But even they couldn't ignore what was obvious. Caroline was running. From what? From accountability, from humiliation, or from a truth she never imagined would echo this loudly. No one knew, but what was clear was this. Caroline Leavitt, once the rising star of the digital right, had become a ghost by sunrise. And then came the audio. At 9:42 a.m., a TikTok user posted a 7-second screen recording of Caroline's podcast app with a previously downloaded episode titled, "Silence is Weakness." But as she tapped play, the audio glitched, then cut. The screen faded into black with only a whisper audible in the static. "If they turn on you, vanish." Whether it was doctored or real didn't matter. The post hit 1 million views in less than an hour. The message was now part of the lore. Her erasure became its own myth, a warning, a symbol, a ghost story for pundits who mistake cruelty for clout. But not everyone was mourning. Many saw her disappearance as poetic. "She walked into a war with a matchbox, thinking the fire wouldn't catch her clothes," one user tweeted. "Now she's ash." Others were more blunt. A viral TikTok clip of Jasmine's silent exit from the courthouse was edited side by side with Caroline's vanishing profiles, soundtracked by Billie Eilish's "All the Good Girls Go to Hell." It wasn't just retribution, it was ritual, a digital cleansing. And Jasmine never said a word. She didn't have to. Still, there was one corner of the internet that refused to let the moment pass quietly. Archive forums and Reddit threads began documenting every trace of Caroline's online existence before it vanished. Screenshots of deleted tweets, transcripts of her broadcasts, even cached forum posts from her early campaigns were preserved like fossils. One user wrote, "Not for sympathy, for evidence. So no one forgets what she said, how she said it, and who she tried to bury with her microphone." Even her Wikipedia page became a battleground. For every edit that tried to soften the language, someone countered with a quote from the courtroom. "Aggressive and ghetto. Free content, baby. If she cries, we win." These phrases, once whispered in private group chats, now stared back from search bars and headlines. By noon, journalists stopped trying to contact Caroline directly. No voicemail, no email replies. Her former assistant told BuzzFeed anonymously, she didn't tell anyone she was pulling the plug. Not her team, not her family. Just gone. A CNN analyst commented, it's like she believes if she disappears fast enough, the shame can't catch her. But it already had. It was embedded in every platform she abandoned. It echoed through every blank page her followers now refreshed obsessively, looking for a final word that would never come. The psychological weight of her silence wasn't lost on the public. Experts began analyzing her disappearance like a cultural autopsy. Dr. Ava Morgan, a clinical trauma expert, told NPR, people often think silence is surrender, but sometimes it's a strategy to avoid confrontation with the self. When a public figure chooses silence this loud, it's not absence, it's collapse. And collapse it was. By 3 p.m., every media outlet had updated their headlines. Caroline Leavitt, vanished in 24 hours, an unprecedented political implosion. The digital self-destruction of a rising star. No exit statement, no goodbye, just ghosts. And yet Jasmine said nothing. She didn't repost the headlines. She didn't comment on the vanishing. She didn't retweet a single meme, nor did she accept a single interview. Her silence wasn't empty. It was sovereign. Because where Caroline's absence screamed guilt, Jasmine's restraint roared with clarity. In a world addicted to reaction, Jasmine Crockett chose not to gloat, but to stand, steady, unmoved, untouched. Meanwhile, protesters marched in New Orleans, holding signs that read, the louder they mocked her, the harder they fell. One marcher wore a shirt with Jasmine's face and the words, respect is not a punchline. And across the city, buildings that once hosted Caroline's speaking tours now booked forums on ethical communication in politics. Her name became a caution, her tactics, a study in what lines should never be crossed again. By midnight, Caroline's digital footprint was 98% gone. Only fragments remained. Ghost tags, comments left unanswered, memories frozen in the accounts of others. But she wasn't just forgotten. She was documented. Not in the way she wanted, trending, powerful, untouchable, but as a symbol of what happens when rhetoric becomes venom and cruelty gets disguised as strategy. And in the stillness of that erasure, the nation understood something it had too often ignored. You can speak freely, yes, but not without weight, not without cost, not forever. And as Caroline's silence stretched into invisibility, the nation turned once more to the woman who never raised her voice, yet moved a country. Atlanta, Spelman College. Late afternoon. The campus was a mosaic of sunlit stone and prideful tradition. A historically black women's college, Spelman had long been a sanctuary for grace under pressure. Now its main auditorium was packed to the rafters. Students lined the walls, professors stood shoulder to shoulder, and every row of balcony seats buzzed with anticipation. Outside, cameras perched like watchful owls. But inside, there was no media frenzy, just reverence. The stage was stark. No digital display, no podium branding, only a single wooden lectern beneath a chandeliered ceiling and Jasmine Crockett standing in a white suit, motionless, eyes steady as granite. For a long moment, she said nothing. And then, like a match striking in a cave, she spoke. Silence, she began, her voice low, unwavering, is not surrender. A hush swept through the crowd like a wind across still water. It is not weakness, it is not concession, and it is not shame. She scanned the room, pausing just long enough for breath, but short enough to let her words linger like gravity. It is the chosen posture of someone who knows exactly what they're worth and refuses to spend that worth reacting to every provocation. Gasps, murmurs, and a wave of silent nods followed. Behind her, the banner of Spelman's motto, a choice to change the world, gleamed in soft gold. Jasmine continued. I didn't win because I shouted louder. I didn't win because I went viral. I didn't win because a courtroom gave me a dollar amount. I stood still while the storm tore itself apart. Applause began in staccato bursts, but quickly became rhythmic. Students held back tears. Professors mouthed amen under their breath. Jasmine wasn't just speaking, she was baptizing the room in truth. She leaned slightly forward, voice sharper now. You do not have to raise your volume to raise your value. The crowd erupted. It wasn't a roar of excitement. It was a collective exhale, as if the room had been waiting months to hear someone articulate what injustice often tries to smother. Dignity doesn't mean passivity. It means precision. It means strength drawn not from rage, but from restraint. Backstage, university faculty stood stone still. One professor whispered, "This will be quoted in classrooms for years." Another murmured, "She just reframed power for an entire generation." And indeed, that very night, dozens of universities from Howard to Stanford began requesting transcripts. Within 48 hours, media ethics departments updated their curriculum syllabi to include the Crockett case, not as a story of scandal, but as a cultural turning point. Responsible speech versus weaponized language, read one lecture title. Another, When Silence Speaks Louder Than Defamation. Panel discussions ignited, student clubs formed coalitions, and a wave of young women, many of color, submitted essays with titles like "My Voice Isn't Fragile," "It's Selective and Truth Doesn't Always Yell." And Jasmine, she didn't linger on stage. No grand exit, no showboating. She simply bowed her head once, whispered, "Thank you," and stepped down, disappearing behind the velvet curtain as flash bulbs flared like lightning through cracked glass. But even that wasn't the most powerful moment of the day. It came hours later. As Jasmine walked quietly toward the black SUV waiting near the service lot, a soft voice called out from behind the metal barricade, "Congresswoman, wait." Security moved to block it, but Jasmine gently waved them off. An elderly black woman stood there, modest cardigan, walking cane, and trembling hands that clutched a small velvet pouch. Her eyes were wet, but they didn't shake. Her voice was tired but deliberate. "I wrote you a letter," she said, voice thin, "but the words didn't feel enough, so I brought you this." She opened the pouch and revealed a pair of delicate pearl earrings, faded slightly with time, but still luminous. "These belong to my mother," the woman said. "She told me to pass them on, but only when I saw a woman who told the truth and didn't need to shout to make it burn." Jasmine stood frozen. For a long second, no one spoke. Then she reached forward, took the earrings with reverent hands, and whispered only two words, "I will." The cameras caught none of it. The media had left. But for the dozen witnesses standing nearby, students, guards, a janitor, a cafeteria staff member, it became the story they would tell their children. Because in a saga defined by noise, slander, courtroom warfare, and digital firestorms, it was the quiet acts, the final speech, the gifted heirloom, the bowed head that sealed Jasmine Crockett's legacy. She wasn't just vindicated, she had rewritten the language of power itself. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.